Good morning.
Hey, everybody. Everyone, as a reminder, please sign into the attendance sheet and the meeting notes, which I pasted into the chat. We could also welcome any newcomers we have. I don't know if anyone, I think I recognize everyone's name.
I think I'm technically a newcomer to the call.
Oh, to this meeting, that's right. Yeah, because we've been talking on Slack and GitHub, but you haven't been in this meeting. Hey, hi, Andrew. If you want to just quickly say hi.
Hey, I'm Andrew. I currently work at Red Hat.
I guess I'm technically new to this call too. I'm Tim, I work at VMware.
Great. Yeah, it's hard to remember like where I see names and whether it's like this particular meeting or not. Hey everybody, thanks for joining. Anybody else? Okay, great. We might have other topics on like specific issues for the spec. One kind of meta issue about the 1.0 release schedule. I wasn't here last week. I don't know if you guys talked about it. One thing I've been wondering is, should we have another release candidate before we mark it as final? We've had like a lot of changes since the original release candidate. They've pretty much been editorial changes. I don't think we're changing a ton in terms of like the meaning of the levels. But there's like quite a lot of text and a lot of new explanation. Terms have changed. And so I was wondering, like, would it be good to have another well-defined release candidate with like a 2-week comment period? And during that comment period, we just don't intend to make any more changes, unlike this past comment period. And then, address any like bug fixes or typos or whatever, but then mark it stable then. On the other hand, there's a desire to just get something out the door. And so this would add more time. So any thoughts one way or the other?
So last week we had discussed versioning. I guess it would depend if that's been settled or not, because I think that was a pretty big item and might need to have something broken apart.
I don't know who's first. Chris is at the top of my list, so I'll say Chris first.
I also wanted to bring up versioning, so thank you, Nicole. I think that I'm in favor of a second release candidate and time bounding it and just scheduling 1.1. Like, why don't we just say we're going to have quarterly releases, big bugs will go into the next one.
I'll jump in next. Yeah, Chris, I think that's a good point, right? Just like having it scheduled, just kind of having that extra just little bump, maybe like you said, Mark, one more review before we do the 1, but then having a scheduled 1.1 on the books so that we don't have to keep extending per se. I think that's a good idea.
I'll go next. Yeah, I like the slightly longer review period for an RC2, but that's, yeah. So let's see. We don't want to keep delaying this either, but I think it might be worth the extra little time.
So I think we ought to have a second candidate release. And so, Mark and I actually worked on something maybe that not everybody has realized, but we had to align the spec stages that we had defined. Thankfully, they were really not too far from it, but to what's in the community specification license framework that we use that governs this work. Brian Belendorf actually pointed that out to me. He said, "Are you guys following this?" And I was like, "Ooh, wait, let me check." And I realized it wasn't exactly the right wording, so we kind of reshaped everything. Thankfully, as the same number of stages, they actually mean the same. But there is an important aspect to it, which is, it's related to licensing commitments that people make when they contribute to the specification. And so it does call for us to make it clear that when we publish a candidate for approved specification being the last stage, which we used to call stable, that's the biggest change. We have to clearly highlight this is an important step, because from a legal point of view, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't want to advise you on what exactly it means. I suggest you get your lawyer to read it if you care and inform you. But essentially, there's some, boundaries. There are some deadlines as to, if you want to exclude some intellectual property you might have related to your contributions and to the specification that's going to be approved. So we didn't really do that because we're not completely on board with what we should have been done. So for that purpose alone, I think we ought to do it and make it clear so we don't have any problem down the line. And also, I think there's been tremendous changes made to the spec. A lot of them can probably be labeled as editorial, but clearly not everything. So I think for that purpose, we ought to have another release. And so from the community specification process point of view, this needs to be at least 2 weeks. We can make it longer, but it cannot be shorter than 2 weeks. So just wanted to give that as background.
I think Andrew was next.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say that I don't think that we need to make it longer than 2 weeks, because I assume that most of the people who were engaged in providing feedback for the first release candidate are probably going to be continued, or hopefully they're continuing to be engaged on the issues. And so I think especially with the recent change that was pushed, where you can actually view the entire table of contents from the perspective of the different versions, I think that makes it really easy to see what all is included. Maybe making a V2 change, or having the RC2 for that other purposes, but also in the communication around it, make sure that we highlight that it's easier to see the entire specification.
I think Trishank might be next.
Oh, sorry, I forgot to lower my hand. I've saved my piece. Thanks.
Okay. David?
Yep. So I guess I'm going to pile on. I do think another round is good for the reasons that Arnaud mentioned, other folks mentioned. There is the issue that if you make so many editorial changes, it's not easy to see what's changed. That said, I think that Mark, I agree with you that we want to put out one that we don't expect more changes on. I don't know how many changes that we've received already. It's possible that there'll be a whole bunch of folks showing up with changes on the very last deadline day, in which case, oh man, we're gonna have to review. It's also possible though that people who are interested are already involved. Most of them have already said their piece. So we may have to make a decision once the deadline's passed. But I would say as soon as we can resolve all comments put in by the deadline, then put out a 2 week, then put it out. I think 2 weeks is fine, especially since people have been given a heads up. But I do think another round makes sense. And I think more than 2 weeks we don't need. This time though, I think we ought to coordinate with Jennifer Bly and basically it was kind of a last minute, oh wait, shouldn't we put a blog post on it? I don't think there's a legal requirement, but I think that from hey, we are honestly doing our best to make people aware to review this that's about to go out the door. I think that's important. So what, I mean, we certainly didn't develop SLSA under a bush, and everything's been done publicly, but I think maximizing the alert means that people have far fewer reasons to complain. I didn't have a chance to comment.
So yeah, my question I think is more on the meta end of like, okay, so let's assume, okay, based on some of the stuff we were talking about last week, a little bit about versioning, and assuming, let's say we do something like, hey, we're going to do quarterly releases, does that also include stuff like what we might consider something that, a bug that wasn't caught, or a typo fix, or whatever? I'm just curious how the community spec maybe outlines certain things like that, so that, just because, hey, I would much rather, if it's already been answered for us in the community spec, let's just follow that.
Yeah, unfortunately, it doesn't. It doesn't go to that level of detail. It doesn't say what, forces you to say, oh, we have to have another one of those 2 weeks period.
So I think I'm next. I have one question. Should we address, there is a whole bunch of to-do in the spec, especially I was rereading verifying build system the other day. And there are a bunch of places where there are to-dos like align the schemas, style, and stuff like that. Should we address all of them before 1.0?
Yes, I think so. I personally would like to have, like, for the next release candidate, it to be basically ready and done. The to-dos resolved. We either make a decision of like, we're either going to do it and we do it, or we're going to defer it to like some future version, but we take out the to-do.
Okay.
I want it to be like in a steady state, so people don't look at it and think it's like half written. Anyone feel free to disagree, but I'm guessing that's not a controversial opinion. Yeah, Michael?
Whoops.
David?
Yeah, so the thumbs up on the getting rid of the to-dos, either do them or remove them. And I agree. I hope that's not terribly controversial. I just realized something. I think we're referring to this as a V1.0. We might want to refer to this as 1.0.0, so that's clearly a version number, because otherwise when we go to, there's a version 1.9, 1.10 is also possibly version 1.1 again. So putting in those 2 dots helps.
David, to that note, there is redirects from the V1 floating tag
Okay.
in the Jekyll configuration. So if somebody goes to V1, if that redirect is changed appropriately, it should direct them to whatever the latest
Yeah, I think the text somewhere says V10, doesn't it? I may be wrong. Maybe misremembering. We say it as V10 often enough. I fear it's gotten into the text somewhere.
I just wanted to follow up on the to-dos. I think the way to do it is to remove them and every time add an issue so that we keep track of them.
Yeah, I think I did a pass of a lot of the to-dos, and most of them, the ones I left are ones that I thought like, I think we ought to do for RC2. So like, I'd rather, or for the stable. So like, any ones where I thought, oh, we could defer it, I already did that. So I think any ones that are left, we should probably be a little bit more critical on to see if it's worth, like, ones where, for example, I think there's ones where like, oh, we should have a diagram here. Because I think like it's just a big wall of text and hard to follow, and a diagram would add a lot. That would be nice if we could just like put out something quickly to just get some sort of visual things like that, or like the terminology is different between these 2 pages. We need to align those. Those seem like ones that we ought to do. Okay, so then in terms of the schedule, which we keep talking about a lot, should we still shoot for like, there's still quite a bit of issues open, but I think we're getting closer and closer, although the project board doesn't look that way, to resolving a lot of the things. Should we shoot for like have all the changes submitted by end of next week, and then we can make a decision for if that's ready or if we need more time? I don't know what the process. I've not worked in open source before, so I don't know like, or on any sort of specification like this. So I don't know like what is a good idea for keeping things on track.
I can just provide my perspective of the past several years of doing. I think at a certain point you just kind of have to call it, and because the thing about open source, right, is since we're all volunteers here and we're all working under sort of a very flexible sort of code of conduct and whatever, like as long as somebody's not outwardly trying to sabotage something, we could keep going and in perpetuity, having stuff like, oh, maybe one more week to clarify this, one more week to clarify that, and it'll just last forever. So at a certain point, I think it's worthwhile to just call it.
Makes sense. I think on this kind of a similar note, for the pull requests that we have, I think we should be trying to, we've talked about this a bunch before, but like err on the side of let's get something, and I know I'm the worst at this, get something that's good enough and submit it. And then so we have something in there, and then we could always have further pull requests. But we have a tendency to leave pull requests open for weeks. And it'd be good if we could try to close the loop faster, especially if we only have 9 or a handful of business days remaining. If we could try to get something that does the job and gets it out, so that way we could kind of tackle the high priority things.
Yes, speaking of which, I think the description across SLSA pages that Andrew posted, 695, should be merged.
I was just looking at that. It looks like there's 2 conflicts that have been introduced. So I'll try and get
Yeah,
well.
that's true. Okay, once you resolve those, I know, and it's a very simple fix actually.
Yeah, I think that the big ones that are still open, the distributing provenance one, I'm not sure what the status is. GitHub isn't very good at telling you like whose turn it is and like what's waiting for what. The distributing provenance, which is 673, unifying, verifying artifacts, which is 675. Description across SLSA page we just mentioned. Format selector, I don't know, that's a pretty minor thing. I don't think that's a blocker. That just do that independently. The combine ephemeral and isolated 700 is going to active comments, and rewrite understanding SLSA was just opened. So we get to, I think the rest of them are either like stale or not particularly urgent. Okay. Anything else on the 1.0 release? So it sounds like, to summarize, release candidate 2 will target another 2 weeks, and we'll discuss next week at the spec meeting to see kind of how we're doing along those lines.
One question: do you expect RC2 to go out as soon as the comment period closes for RC1, or is it it depends?
The comment period closes at the end of this week.
Yeah.
I don't know. We talked in the past about we want. I think we talked about. I think like releases announcements are generally better on like middle of the week. I don't know if that also applies to the release candidate, or if we want to do it on like a Friday or a Monday. But I would imagine, you know, we could maybe target all the changes we want in submitted by the 31st, say, and then cut the release candidate the first week of April.
Well, Mark, let's assume that we got very, very few comments by the end of this current path, which is entirely plausible since I think many people who are interested are, well, here. How long would it take us to cut a new version that addresses what we want to do, including all the to-dos?
That's the question. That's what we're trying to answer.
Yeah.
I mean, there's like a bunch of open issues, I guess. I'm hoping that we could get through it within the next 2 weeks. And for most of them, just say like, good enough, postpone, or actually address.
Yeah.
Because a lot of the issues are not so much like this needs to be fixed, but for example, like there's issues 365, I'm looking at a random one now. What counts as service generated? Some of these issues were opened a while ago and haven't had further comments on. And so maybe we could just say, it's good enough. We haven't had any specific comments. We haven't talked about it for a while. Maybe we don't need any further clarification here.
Yeah.
I think the most important ones are things that would basically break, you know, where people implement and then we change. And it's like, well, thank you. Now, because of your change, I'm no longer compliant. That's really bad. So we want to avoid those as much as possible. But if it's more like, you know, oh, it may be not completely clear, we could maybe do it better, then it becomes a bit more like, okay, it's not so critical.
Yeah, agreed. And I think it'd be valuable, like, again, we have this project board, which I'll paste in the chat and also on the in the meeting notes. There's a bunch of things listed here. If one seem like they're either addressed or lower priority that we don't need to do, it certainly would be valuable to like comment on them and you know, move them off of this project board and say we're not going to do it. Either close as good enough, close as we're not going to do, or remove from 1.0 tag. Okay. Are there any other topics that are worth discussing now?
Not really, but I would say in other open source projects, something that we've done is collectively as a community close issues together. So if we have some time now, we could do that, but that's just a suggestion.
Andrew?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the questions. If we had any questions now, we don't have to address it immediately, but I didn't want, I wanted to know if as part of the ephemeral and isolated conversations that are happening, I feel like what I'm trying to differentiate on is between level 3 and level 4 isolated. And I didn't want to know, or I wanted to know how specific in the future directions we should be about what we're looking at going forward for level 4, or if that should just be documented as a GitHub issue and then just leave it generic in the future directions.
Yeah, so the context here is pull request 700, which I just linked to in the meeting notes. I'll send it in the chat too. This in the background here, this ephemeral and isolated is the topic of many of the comments we've had in the past. And so I think this is really valuable to resolve. Especially if you could comment on the pull request. I think there's like getting the wording right, I think is pretty tricky. To recap what we discussed, Andrew and I on the thread, it seems like we're kind of zeroing in on the requirements for level 3 are things from the build system that the build system must guarantee. And there's no requirements on like what the tenant has to do or the producer has to do. The original wording had some should recommendations, which was kind of ambiguous and confusing. And so we were discussing like, how can we make this more clear? And it seems like the basic kind of idea is that at level 3, it must be kind of secure by default, but if the users open up, like a port, like with SSH or something on it, for example, which would allow a remote user to just kind of run arbitrary commands, that is not something that has to be blocked by level 3, but maybe a future version would. And so like, how do we clearly express that like the builder has a requirement to like be to some amount of secure, but they don't have to like block everything? Does that capture it, Andrew? I'm not sure I said that very well.
Yeah, I think so. And where I kind of understood the isolation for level 3 is that we want to try to, it comes back to, I think, the best effort wording around provenance. As a build system, we need to work towards making a best effort to ensuring that the provenance is accurate. And so like part of the confusion that I came towards this conversation with is around the difference between the build system and the producer. And the suggestion that I made is that the producer should not intentionally subvert the build system's best effort for provenance generation. And so I think trying to figure out how to word the maximum isolation in level 3 from both the producer and the build system in order to achieve that best effort. And then it's not until you go to level 4 where you can hopefully achieve maybe a little bit better than best effort once you start having further requirements on the build system and on the user to prevent the like network access and whatnot, that you can be reasonably confident that everything that is contained in the references for the builds is actually all that's needed to produce the artifact. Chris?
I just want to make sure I understand correctly. So is the idea then that at L3, the build process is not, it's not adversarial between the user provided build and the platform?
I don't know if I'd phrase it that way. I think there is some like adversarial of like the build, like let's say the build platform has signing keys or some sort of cryptographic secret. The producer shouldn't be allowed to get those, so that is still a boundary. And like 2 builds still need to be isolated from one another. I think that it's more around like if you, I think I phrase it this way, I'm not sure Andrew agrees with me. Like if you just use the service by default in like the normal way, you will have isolation between builds, and the provenances, particularly like the external parameters list, will be accurate and complete. And if someone were to rerun that build with those same external parameters, they'll get the same result. Maybe not bit for bit identical, because maybe it's not reproducible, but like logically, they'll kind of get the same thing. But a build that kind of violates the spirit of level 3 might say, open up a port that allows like something else to connect and run arbitrary commands, or might farm out the execution to another service that's not part of the builder. And there's no requirement for the build service to like block that from happening, because doing that sort of blocking would be another level. It'd be too expensive.
And speaking to the adversarialness of it, I think that there are like, you're going to have different levels of or different types of attack vectors that you're going to be able to protect against with level 3 and level 4. And so with level 3, the important thing is to level 3 is there to help drive adoption to these build systems, which can provide level 3 build, whatever the terminology is, verification. And then it's not until you go further are you trying to really get beyond what is just the provenance. So at level 3, we're trying to make sure that we have reasonable confidence around the provenance. But then at level 4 is when it feels like you're interested in builds produced with level 4 provenance, level 4 build, when you are more concerned about that attack vector from malicious adversarial actors. And so I think that it's okay to leave the room for some of these attacks in level 3, which we're not going to be able, and somebody looking at just the level 3 specification might ask the same question as you, which is I think why it's partially a challenging situation to only describe level 3, knowing that there's a level 4 further, knowing that we're leaving wiggle room here for an intentional malicious actor to do something really wonky with their build where their provenance is completely inaccurate.
That makes sense to me. Then I think my only concern is that we have, so going from level 1 to 4, we have potentially 2 discontinuities where level 1 to level 2, you might need to change build system. Level 3 to level 4, you may need to change the logic of your build. I think that's okay, but I wanted to point it out. Otherwise, it all sounds good to me.
Right, and I think I tried to make that clearer with an earlier PR, where the action for the producer to achieve level 3 is really just to onboard to a level 3 compliant build system. And so it is intentionally, the first is to kind of drive adoption towards these systems which have it in mind to try and harden themselves. And then only once they get into those avenues of these hardened systems, can they then explore the possibility of trying to further harden against these attack vectors?
Okay, I thought that the action for level 2 is getting onto the build system that has goals for isolating itself. So I guess, okay, level 2 to level 3, the user doesn't have to do anything. Level 3 to level 4, they do. That's fine.
So in my head, I was describing it as the maximum now. So I haven't been focused on anything other than level 3
Got
to see what the intricacies are. But in order to achieve the maximum now, all you have to do basically is to start using some compliant system. Whenever level 4 comes around, what you have to do to achieve the maximum is still use the compliant system and make changes to the workflow to generate these artifacts.
Okay. Okay.
So two things. I think that there's still some minutia there around like what counts as the sort of end user developers responsibility versus the, let's say in certain cases, right, the implementer of the build service. So somebody who's actually deploying out something other than, because I know a lot of the focus has been on stuff like GitHub Actions, but like Tecton and Tecton Chains, right? And Tecton Chains, right, can do stuff like Salsa level 2, but you still have to give it, let's say, a key. And so the idea there, right, is you could still end up with a situation where based on how you've set up Tecton and Tecton Chains, even though it could do level 2, your job doesn't provide a key, so it doesn't actually sign it with, so it doesn't make it Salsa level 2, it's Salsa level 1. So there's some stuff there as well beyond just sort of like the, hey, these are things you actually need to make part of your, the lower level build in order to kind of get that to work. I think that there's also separately, I think that one of the things I think would be really useful is really kind of focusing a little bit more on the like, what are the actual attack vectors, so that we can then kind of transform that into sort of the levels there. Because like, I think one of the things that's a little unclear to me is like, what is, let's say, the attack vector that Salsa level 2 would protect against versus level 3? And I think I have some thoughts around it, but I think that sort of thing is I don't want to say that this is the case exactly, but like one of the things that's confusing me is it's unclear exactly like, is the requirements we're adding in to say, hey, here's the attack vector and this is what we're trying to prevent, so these are the new requirements? Or are the requirements just kind of there and saying like, hey, what are the attack vectors this would protect against? I'm not saying that's the latter ones, that's the case. I just think it's currently a little confusing.
And at least tangentially related to that is issue number 706 that Mark opened today, again, and that came out of this ephemeral and isolated PR, explain that you must define a security model for your build system. Because I think that Michael, what I hear when you're saying that is that we need to make sure that anybody who's developing a build system has a security model so that they know what is within the trust boundary and what is not within the trust boundary. Because not until you know where that line is, where you differentiate trusted versus untrusted, can you start to make those types of decisions about how do you validate when data crosses the trust boundary. It's not exactly the same thing that you're asking, but I feel like it's maybe at least a necessary requirement in order to get to that level.
I agree, and I think that there's also a couple of distinctions. I think we do a pretty good job at kind of separating out now the idea of build system and build service and some of these other things. I do think that we might need to be a bit clearer, because I think at least right now, I think the vast majority of folks who are doing Salsa, from what I can tell, and once again, this is just publicly, at least like that I can tell, are obviously using GitHub Actions and those sorts of things, where a lot of the things around what that trust boundary is not directly under your control. There's certain things like the reusable workflow and exactly what GitHub action you're using and so on. But like a lot of the stuff around, like, you're sort of largely assuming that GitHub, when it says, hey, different jobs should not be able to, they're isolated and they should not, one job should not be able to interact with another job. You're sort of trusting GitHub on that. I think that there's some open questions about like, yeah, and when sort of exploring that just a bit more generically, like if I look at, let's say, Jenkins, or I look at some of these things, it's not just purely about the tool, it's also how you've configured the tool and what sort of constraints you've also potentially set up on the end users of that tool, right? Like Jenkins is pretty well known for being pretty open by default, but by placing, the implementer of that thing could place a ton of restrictions on it that could make it, SLSA level 3, but that SLSA level 3 thing is going to look very different than just Jenkins, the build tool.
Do we need to clarify that?
Which thing?
The whole, hey, running Jenkins all by itself doesn't do X. We clarify the requirements. Maybe we need to clarify this doesn't meet it.
I think, I think the thing there is, and I think we do a decent job at the build system, but we might want to sort of clarify a bit that when we say build system, we're not purely saying Jenkins, Tecton, GitHub Actions. We're saying it's those things, and we do have some things in there. We do have some things around that the build system consists of the people and processes and so on that surround it. We just might want to make sure that we're given that there's a bunch of stuff out there. I think we just need to make sure that we're crystal clear that a lot of folks assume build tool here, like Jenkins, Tecton, yada yada. It's those things configured in the right ways with the right security in mind that are capable of that. And I think that sort of thing, though, is does get confusing because a lot of folks are going to be evaluating and saying, at what point is it like, because any tool if you configure it the right way and you add the right sorts of plugins and you change it in the right ways, could be SLSA level 3 compliant. But like certain tools are inevitably going to be like out of the box, it's more or less SLSA compliant. You just got to do this. Whereas definitely with something, let's say like a Jenkins, not Jenkins X can do it, but like the normal Jenkins, it would take a lot more effort to configure it that way.
I agree on that. That in the end, it's more what will be build level 3 or 2 will be the builder ID rather than the build type. I mean, for example, you can host GitHubs or GitLabs on your own, and they can be completely insecure. And you can, if you don't run them in a separate user, you are breaking SLSA in some ways. So yeah, it's the instance of the builder. It's not the builder framework in the end. I don't know if the right words that matter. It's more how it is instantiated and configured. I agree on that.
Yeah, thanks. So can I ask folks who participate in this conversation to have an opinion to review Andrew's pull request? So that way we could figure out basically what the spec should say. I agree. Thank you, by the way, whoever's taking notes. I really, really appreciate it. You're doing a great job. So thank you so much. It doesn't say who it is on my screen, at least.
It's me. I obsessively take notes wherever I am.
Thank you, Nicole. Like the self-hosted versus, centrally hosted, I feel like I agree is a big thing that comes up a lot and people want to know, and I feel like we should answer that. So if you could comment on the pull request and get, we could do it there. I think that'd be great. I do want to, if we have a few minutes left, to talk just about terminology, which is one other thing that for the 1.0 release, I would like to get resolved because it's going to be much harder to change later. Arno, you brought up expectations. Do you want to go first?
Yeah, so expectations actually, so it bears on pull request, is it 675? So the way the 1.0 RC1 has it is, it says that expectations are a set of constraints on the package's provenance metadata that the package producer sets. And the proposal, I mean, if PR 675 were to be merged as is, it actually changes this to saying that, you know, it's the provenance verifier that sets the expectation. And I think that's a major change that we need to really nail down. And I think it comes from a bit of a confusion. I think the intent is that, you know, it's understood that at the end of the day, the verifier is in control. They can set their own policies. They can define, you know, what they are going to rely on to do the verification. And so from that point of view, they can override whatever comes from the package producer anyway. But I think the initial intent was to say, well, there is some kind of default expectations that are being defined by the package producer that is carried as part of the provenance metadata, and that the verifier can take or leave as it wants. But so this is a bit different from what and the pull request, as I pointed out in the comments, is not very consistent, because in some places it basically says that, and I have to give Josh credit. He is the one who defined it in the way I just said it, which is the producer sets default expectations and the verifier can use those and may override them as they want. I actually think that model is right, and we should, you know, make sure that the text matches that model. But Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, so I agree with the framing of setting expectations and setting a verification policy. Actually, I hadn't heard that from Josh. I had a talk with Kara, with Kara at the end of last week. She brought that up to me. I'm happy with that split. My main concern, or I had two main concerns. The first is that whatever we do needs to work for a trust on first use model, because that is more or less how the internet works, and we need some support for that. And the other is that I didn't want to put us in a situation where a party has a responsibility that is not actionable, because that means that nobody is responsible. And so my concern was that if the package producer is responsible for making sure that a verifier's policy, or whatever, a verifier's expectations are correct, they can't do anything. And so that's what I was trying to clarify. As long as, if we split terminology, I'm perfectly happy, and I can make that change to the PR today.
So I think we need to confirm the model, right? Once we have the model, we all agree this is what we want to say. We can work on the detail, the beyond the text, and I'm happy to review again some changes. But so I want to know if anybody disagree with the model I laid out. Which is actually, by the way, it's in a comment from Joshua further down in the pull request. Go ahead.
So just to clarify, what you're saying is that there should be data coming through from the person who made the package, but the verifier has the right to override things. Is that kind of the TLDR?
That's right.
Okay,
I mean, at the end of the day, verifier is always in control anyway, right? By definition, they can define their own rules, their own policy as to what they take into account or not. So we are not claiming to change that. We cannot constrain what the verifier trust and takes into account. But the question is whether there are expectations that are set by the producers that are, and what role, you know, this has. So I like the model that Joshua laid out, which is basically the consumer can take a slash verifier can take that as the default. But it's, you know, it's part of the input they get. They can do what they want with that after.
So I do worry though that we're using the term set expectations in two ways. And that is what caused my confusion. I see by the way, the comment you mentioned about Josh now, I actually accepted that already. I'm guessing you haven't seen it since then, but there is still the problem that a producer sets expectations and a verifier set expectations, but that means two things.
I a little bit worry that we are using expectations like jargon to mean a particular concept, but that concept is not fully fleshed out. Because like if we just talk in like kind of real world terms, I think that basically the way it works is that the producer has to build in some way, and like it maybe using passive voice because it's a little bit easier here. Like it must be knowable what, for example, source repo this thing is supposed to come from. Like when you use, say, the _JS package, there needs to be like a proper thing to compare it against, right? Like there is some sort of official upstream. And I guess we could talk about in the spec of like who decides what the official one is. But I would imagine in most cases when I use _JS, like I don't know, I'm gonna use some sort of process to figure that out. And maybe it's like I do a search and like that's the first one and I say, okay, that's good enough. Or there's metadata in NPM that says that that's what it's supposed to be. But I think that's basically what we're trying to say is that like you can know what the thing is supposed to be built from. And I think what we're maybe running into is that like in reality, it's messy. And I worry that if we say the package producer does this, or the ecosystem does this, or the consumer does this, I wonder if a little bit more vagueness would actually be useful. Yeah, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, I think inevitably a lot of it is going to be an agreement between the producer and verifier, right? And like when I think about it, right, I think about, hey, if I've worked at companies large and small, and I think the thing is like large companies are going to say, hey, they want to make sure a bunch of stuff from at least like the people they're actually buying from, right? They're going to say, well, we expect this stuff is going to be in your SLSA metadata, because it's not just like, I think SLSA mostly has been focused around guaranteeing that the provenance is tamper evident or tamper proof. But I think different companies are going to say, what information do I want in that provenance? And I think what we'll see is the consumers, right, are going to say, hey, I demand that if I buy something from you, that you're going to include in your provenance, this source, like exactly the source that it came from, or whatever, or here what the resolved dependency should look like. And I think that itself is okay. I think it's going to be a little bit more complicated when you look at open source, because you can't really make a demand of an open source provider in most cases, right? Like it's going to be different. Let's say if you go after like a big sort of distro out there, like Debian or whatever, right? Saying, hey, we would love it if you had this in your provenance is probably reasonable. Compared to, some random person who, writes an NPM package on the weekend and saying, actually, we want all this information in there, and that's going to put a big burden on you. And then I think, I still think that, generally the build service, right, is more responsible just purely for saying, I did all the right things from a requirements level to sign the stuff, to sort of show that tamper, to show those security properties, more so than necessarily saying, hey, the build service is responsible for making sure that I can fetch the upstream package or something like that, or upstream source.
Okay, so what is the next step for this?
I will I will update my PR with what I understand to be the outcome of this conversation. I will do that by the end of the day today, Pacific time. If everyone else who is interested could review it in the next day or so, I would appreciate it. We can go from there.
As someone whose entire business model is building things from source and letting open source people build things from source on our system if they want to get provenance stuff, I like that last paragraph where we were saying that the build system should be saying, I can do all of this. And then it's kind of like, well, you know, not guaranteeing the upstream, because if the open source maintainer tells us rubbish, we're going to put the rubbish in there, you know.
Does that sound good to you, Arna?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, you know, just one piece. I mean, Chris, you said you had accepted Josh's comment, and I agree. The problem is now there's a bit of inconsistency in different part of the documents we have. That's all I meant. Thanks. Plan sounds good to me.
We could also open a issue and like work on that necessarily, not just in one PR, but do a subsequent PR to do a pass and make sure.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I was intrigued by the last comment. I'm sorry I didn't hear, I wasn't sure who said it, but basically, you know, if a build system gets instructions to do rubbish, that's what it's going to do. We don't want to impose unreasonable requirements. Is this going in the, are there any other concerns? I'm sorry, I didn't know who said that. Was that you, Nicole?
Yeah, that was me. And I agree with the way that we're setting this up to be because
Okay.
of that. And
Okay.
so I'm just saying, like, I 100% agree. I can't be responsible for verifying it's correct, because when I'm fed garbage, I'm going to output garbage. So.
Right. Will you be double checking just to make sure? Because that seems like an important point, and I don't think anybody intended for ask build system to do the impossible. Just we want to make sure that we don't accidentally say that.
Yeah, I'll give it a review and at least see if it sounds to me like, you know, we get out of that, get a, you know, to best effort, you know, must be verifiably produced and signed so that I can say exactly what I did and who gave me what. And then this way we can say, well, Bob gave me X. X is rubbish, but that's not my fault. I recorded Bob gave it to me and I made it, you know, verifiable.
Sounds good. Okay, we're out of time. Thank you, everybody. And let's continue chatting on those. And if you're able to review, that would be super helpful. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.